this episode, we're going to make security frameworks feel practical instead of abstract, because beginners often hear the word framework and assume it means a huge document that nobody reads. The truth is that frameworks exist because security is complicated, organizations are messy, and people need a shared way to decide what good security looks like. A framework is a structured way to organize security goals, controls, and activities so teams can plan, communicate, and improve without reinventing the wheel every time. Frameworks help you answer basic questions like what should we do first, how do we know we are doing enough, and how do we explain our security posture in a consistent language. They also help align security work with business reality, because frameworks can be used to map risks to controls and controls to outcomes. The most important thing to understand is that a framework is not the goal by itself. It is a tool for guiding action. By the end of this, you should be able to explain why frameworks exist, how they help teams prioritize and communicate, and how to use them in a way that leads to real improvements rather than paperwork. A good starting point is recognizing the problem frameworks solve. Security work can easily become reactive, scattered, and inconsistent without a common structure. One team might focus on patching, another might focus on access control, another might focus on monitoring, and everyone might assume someone else is handling the gaps. When an incident happens or an audit arrives, the organization realizes that pieces are missing and that people have different definitions of what secure means. A framework provides a shared reference model, so multiple groups can coordinate and understand how their work fits together. It helps prevent security from being defined by the loudest voice or the most recent crisis. It also helps organizations avoid ignoring basic controls while chasing shiny new tools. For beginners, it helps to think of a framework like a map for a large city. You can drive without a map, but you will waste time, you will miss important routes, and you will struggle to explain where you're going to others. A framework gives you common landmarks and routes, so planning and navigation become more efficient. Frameworks also exist because security is a risk management problem, not a single technical problem with a single correct answer. Different organizations have different risk tolerances, different regulatory obligations, and different technical environments, so a framework cannot be a one-size-fits-all checklist that guarantees safety. Instead, a framework provides categories and guidance that help you choose controls that match your risks and priorities. This is why frameworks usually emphasize outcomes and coverage rather than prescribing one specific implementation. For example, many frameworks aim to ensure you address identity, asset management, vulnerability management, incident response, and monitoring in some form, but they do not force you into one product or one architecture. That flexibility is a feature because it allows the same framework to be relevant across many environments. For beginners, the key is to see frameworks as a way to reduce decision chaos. They narrow the field of what you should consider and help you justify why you chose certain actions over others. That justification becomes important when you need budget, when you need leadership support, or when you need to explain security posture to stakeholders. A purposeful way to use a framework begins with understanding that frameworks create a common vocabulary for security conversations. Without a shared vocabulary, people talk past each other because one person might say we need better security and mean patching, while another might mean monitoring and another might mean policy. A framework breaks security into recognizable areas, so teams can be specific and consistent. This helps in planning, because you can say we are strong in certain areas and weak in others, and you can show a roadmap for improving. It also helps in reporting, because you can communicate progress in a structured way rather than in a scattered list of projects. For beginners, the vocabulary aspect is surprisingly powerful because it supports collaboration. When teams share the same categories, it becomes easier to coordinate ownership, avoid duplication, and identify gaps. It also makes it easier to onboard new staff, because the framework provides a consistent mental model of what security work includes. The result is not just better documentation, but better alignment of effort. Frameworks guide action by helping you prioritize controls based on risk and maturity rather than based on habit. A beginner mistake is to treat a framework like a checklist where every item is equally urgent. In practice, a framework is more useful when you use it to identify the most important gaps first. For example, if an organization lacks basic visibility through logging, then advanced threat hunting will struggle because there is not enough data to hunt effectively. If an organization lacks strong identity controls, then many other controls become weaker because attackers can simply steal credentials and bypass defenses. A framework helps you see those dependencies because it organizes controls in a way that reveals foundational capabilities versus advanced enhancements. Purposeful use also means selecting a scope because frameworks can be broad, and trying to implement everything at once often leads to shallow, low-quality outcomes. The goal is to choose high-impact improvements that reduce real risk and that can be sustained over time. When frameworks are used this way, they become practical guides rather than compliance burdens. Another way frameworks guide action is by connecting security activities to measurable outcomes. Beginners often struggle with measuring security because they look for a single number that represents safety, but security does not work like that. Frameworks encourage measurement at the capability level, such as whether key controls exist, whether they are adopted, and whether they are effective. For example, instead of saying we are secure, you might measure how quickly critical vulnerabilities are patched, how consistently multi-factor authentication is enforced, and how quickly the team can detect and respond to incidents. Those measurements are not perfect, but they are more meaningful than vague statements. Frameworks also help you decide what to measure because they define what areas matter. If you adopt a framework that emphasizes detection and response, you will naturally look for metrics around logging coverage, alert quality, and response times. If you adopt a framework that emphasizes governance, you will measure policy adoption and risk management practices. The key is that frameworks push you toward measuring the right kinds of things, which supports continuous improvement. Purposeful measurement is not about proving perfection. It is about making progress visible and reducing risk systematically. A common misuse of frameworks is treating them as a compliance exercise where the goal is to check boxes rather than to reduce risk. This happens when organizations focus on producing documents that claim controls exist without validating whether those controls are actually working. It also happens when the framework becomes a substitute for judgment, where teams implement controls that do not match their environment just because the framework mentions them. Purposeful use avoids this by constantly asking how a control reduces a real risk and how the organization will verify that the control is effective. Verification might include testing, monitoring, and incident lessons learned, not just written policy. Another misuse is trying to adopt multiple frameworks at once without mapping them, which can create duplicated effort and conflicting priorities. Many frameworks overlap, so using multiple can be valuable, but only if you translate between them and keep a clear primary structure. For beginners, the takeaway is that frameworks are tools, and tools can be used well or poorly. The best use is grounded in risk, validated through evidence, and sustained through ownership and measurement. Frameworks also help guide action by supporting communication across levels of an organization. Security work often fails not because the team lacks technical knowledge, but because the team cannot get alignment and support. Frameworks help you explain needs and progress to leaders who are not security specialists by using consistent categories and outcomes. Instead of describing a list of technical projects, you can describe how the organization is improving its ability to identify assets, protect access, detect threats, respond to incidents, and recover operations. That type of language connects to business priorities like uptime, customer trust, and compliance. Frameworks also help when dealing with partners and auditors because a shared reference model reduces ambiguity about expectations. For beginners, it is important to see that communication is part of security effectiveness. If you cannot explain why a control matters and what outcome it supports, you will struggle to get resources and cooperation. Frameworks make that explanation easier by providing a recognized structure and vocabulary. Another purposeful use of frameworks is building a roadmap, which is a planned sequence of improvements that respects dependencies and organizational capacity. Security improvements are rarely one-time changes. They require ongoing operations, maintenance, and monitoring. A roadmap based on a framework helps you choose an order that makes sense, such as strengthening identity, improving logging, and building incident handling capability before investing heavily in advanced analytics. It also helps you coordinate across teams, because different parts of the framework can be owned by different groups, and a roadmap clarifies who is responsible for what. A roadmap is also a way to manage expectations, because it shows that security maturity grows over time rather than appearing instantly. For beginners, the key is that purposeful framework use is iterative. You assess where you are, pick the most important improvements, implement them with quality, measure and validate, then reassess and continue. That cycle turns the framework into a living guide rather than a static reference. When you bring all of this together, using security frameworks purposefully means using them to organize thinking, align teams, prioritize actions, and measure progress in a way that reduces real risk. Frameworks exist because security is too complex to manage purely by instinct, and because organizations need a shared model for what security includes. They guide action by providing vocabulary, revealing dependencies, supporting measurement, and enabling communication across technical and non-technical audiences. They become powerful when they are used as a map and a roadmap, not as a checklist and not as a performance show. For a beginner, the most important takeaway is that frameworks are not about making security feel bureaucratic. They are about making security manageable. They help you move from scattered efforts to coordinated improvement, from vague claims to measurable progress, and from reactive firefighting to proactive risk reduction. As you continue into specific frameworks in the next topics, keep this mindset. The framework is valuable when it helps you decide what to do next and when it helps you prove that what you did actually made the organization safer.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.